Some stories begin with a gunshot. Some begin with a scream. Ours began with a pattern. And beneath it all, hidden in the dark channels of the dying internet, a conversation, cold, precise, wrong. This is the story of recognition, of the instant when noise becomes pattern, pattern becomes proof, and proof arrives just in time to witness the fall. This is the story of the Apocalypse Payload, and this is Chapter 1, The Noise That Doesn't Belong. Welcome to the world of Echothis. The rain in Aviary City never really fell so much as it leaked from the sky, like the city had sprung a crack in heaven. It slid down broken facades and pooled in the ribs of abandoned scaffolding. It drummed on sheet metal, hissed against old transformer boxes, and traced the long black seams in the asphalt below Barnes's window. Somewhere in the distance, beyond a row of municipal buildings that looked as though they had been chewed and spat back out by time, a warning siren coughed once, thought better of it, and died. Inside, the safe house hummed, not loudly. Nothing hummed loudly anymore. Power was too expensive, too rationed, too moody for confidence. The room glowed with the weak, stubborn light of monitors and battery backups, a little island of clean logic fenced off against the rot outside. The concrete walls had once belonged to a records annex, city archives, tax files, the sort of bureaucratic graveyard no one visited unless forced at legal gunpoint. Now, the shelves held Pelican cases, spare drives, cable rolls, sealed water bricks, field notebooks, trauma kits, ammunition, canned soup, and 3 different brands of coffee. Barnes hated for 3 different reasons. His workstation sat at the center of it all, his altar to method. A ruggedized laptop ran CSI Linux with the lid open like a steel jaw, connected to a second screen salvaged from a security desk downtown. Beside it sat a compact travel router, an external SSD, a write blocker, a USB data diode, a battered notebook covered in cramped handwriting, and a ceramic mug that had once said, "World's okayest investigator." The rest of the phrase had burned away in some earlier incident involving a hot plate, a bad extension cord, and Barnes saying, with characteristic foresight, "That doesn't look ideal." He leaned back in his chair and scrubbed a hand over his face. He had the kind of tiredness that lived behind the eyes and rented long-term. His hair needed cutting. His stubble had drifted past deliberate into accidental. The blue-white light of the monitors sharpened his features into angles, nose, cheekbones, brow, giving him the look of a man assembled by someone who favored utility over charm. On the left screen, a Tor browser session ran through a chain he had spent 2 hours hardening because paranoia was not a pathology. It was a maintenance habit. On the right, he had notes open in a text editor, timestamps stacked against aliases, onions, and thread references. He scrolled. Hidden services rose and fell like diseased mushrooms in the dark. Forums, drop sites, broker boards, invitation-only chats with names that tried too hard to sound clever and ended up sounding like they'd been coined by a knife in a human suit. Barnes had lived in that ecosystem long enough to recognize its dialects. Ransom crews had their rhythms. Brokers had their bragging posture. PT-adjacent operators liked their irony dry and their operational language clean. Every subculture on the dark web had tells, verbal fingerprints left in syntax, timing, and the kinds of details people assumed no one would notice. Barnes noticed. That was the job. Not the official version, maybe. The official version had once involved words like cyber forensic specialist and digital intelligence consultant and other polished nonsense designed to justify invoices to people who believed the internet was a location. But the real job, the useful part, was noticing when something in the noise didn't belong. Tonight, something didn't. He clicked open a thread inside a hidden service discussion board that had appeared 4 days ago, gone dormant, then sprung back to life with a cluster of replies in the last 6 hours. The board itself was nominally dedicated to infrastructure intrusion, industrial environments, logistics systems, municipal networks, the kind of place where people discussed access persistence with the warmth normal humans reserved for grandchildren. Barnes had been tracking it because a known broker alias had resurfaced there under a slight variation, the sort of lazy vanity that killed people in his line of work. But the thread that had caught his eye wasn't about privilege escalation, initial access, or destructive malware. It was titled Window Confirmation. He read it again. No malware family names, no references to exploit chains, no jokes about blue teams, federal badges, or patch cycles. Instead, there was language that should have fit and somehow didn't. Payload readiness, staging conditions, latency expectations, release window, uptake models. He drummed his fingers once on the desk. Uptake models, he muttered. That one bothered him. Threat actors borrowed terminology all the time. Military language, finance language, medicine language. They looted vocabularies the way desperate men looted pharmacies, grab whatever might keep the operation moving. But there was a difference between using jargon and sounding like you belonged to it. This thread sounded like someone wearing a hacker's coat over a lab coat and assuming the dark would hide the cut. Barnes took a sip of coffee, grimaced, and immediately regretted confirming that it was still coffee. He copied several posts into his notes and tagged them with timestamps. The primary handles in the thread were crude things: Pharaoh_12, Sableglass, Vector Winter, Oxblood, and one recent entrant, Null Harvest. Null Harvest had posted only twice, but both messages had the clipped confidence of someone used to being listened to. No flourish, no performance, just clean instructions. Those were the ones Barnes kept returning to. He opened another terminal, checked his routing, then began a separate capture workflow for the thread. If it disappeared by morning, and in this corner of the web, things disappeared the way bodies disappeared in rivers. He wanted the full structure preserved. Pages, links, source artifacts, external references. He started a Hunchly session to archive what he could, then manually documented thread IDs and onion paths in case the service rotated or died. Outside, thunder rolled over the city in a low metallic groan. The room behind him creaked, not because anyone had entered. The building just did that, expanded, settled, muttered to itself like an old man arguing with ghosts. Barnes had gotten used to it, mostly. He enlarged one of the replies, Pharaoh_12. Window holds if environmental factors remain stable. Vector Winter. What are projected losses? Null Harvest. Within acceptable range. Do not confuse noise with failure. Early agitation is anticipated. Sableglass. And public interpretation? Null Harvest. Initial presentation will not trigger correct classification. That is the advantage. Barnes stopped moving. He reread the exchange. Then again, slower. Initial presentation, correct classification, advantage. He looked over to the notebook, uncapped a pen, and wrote the phrase down in block letters so hard the tip nearly tore through the paper. Cute, he said to no one. That's not ominous at all. Supernormal villain nonsense. Very healthy. He leaned back again and stared at the ceiling for a second, letting the language settle in his head. A PT chatter often flirted with theatricality. People who spent their nights breaking systems sometimes developed the social instincts of theater kids with better OPSEC. But the tone here was wrong. Too controlled, too little ego. No one was bragging. They were monitoring. Monitoring what? He shifted to another window and pulled up a running map of onion references, aliases, and historical activity. CSI Linux had long since become less an operating system to him than an extension of the way he thought. He knew where everything lived, how the tools behaved, which workflows were elegant and which merely worked. He kept a workspace for Tor capture, another for notes, another for passive recon, and one more for correlation, not because he was compulsive, though that accusation had been made, repeatedly, and not always unfairly, but because mess hid pattern. He opened a terminal and checked a few old references he had on Vector Winter. Nothing recent. The alias had popped up 8 months earlier in a closed procurement channel related to cold storage transit, then vanished. That had seemed odd then. It seemed more odd now. Cold storage. He added it to the board. A floorboard groaned from the hallway. Barnes didn't turn right away. "You walk any heavier, Ed. I'm going to start billing you for seismic activity." "Good," came the reply. "Maybe then you'll earn enough to buy coffee that doesn't taste like filtered regret." Ed stepped into the room carrying a flashlight and a half-open packet of crackers, like he'd just returned from a tactical engagement with the pantry and had won by attrition. He was taller than Barnes, broader through the shoulders, older by a couple of decades and harder by several more. Even in a faded gray thermal and cargo pants, he looked like someone who had once spent years moving with purpose under dangerous skies and had never quite agreed to stop. His hair was mostly silver now, cut close. A white scar ran from just below his left ear into his collar, pale as chalk in the monitor light. His face had a weathered calm to it, the expression of a man who had seen panic perform all its tricks and remained unimpressed. He glanced at the screens. "You still on that onion circus?" "That good kind of M or the bad kind?" Barnes pointed at the thread. "The kind where I can't decide if I'm looking at prep chatter for a municipal systems strike or the opening chapter of a manifesto written by people who should not own microscopes." Ed stepped closer, reading with the patience of someone translating a dialect he loathed. "Payload window losses, uptake." He frowned. "Sounds medical." "Thank you, Dr. Doom." "I'm serious." "So am I." Ed looked at him. "You think it's real?" Barnes swiveled slightly in the chair. "That depends on what it is. Threat actors love borrowing language outside their lane, makes them feel educated. This could still be malware. Industrial, maybe. Public-facing service disruption, maybe something designed to hit health systems or transport. Initial presentation could mean symptom visibility in telemetry. Correct classification could mean defenders mislabeling the intrusion. You believe that? I believe it's possible." Ed crunched a cracker. "That's not what I asked." Barnes exhaled through his nose and turned back to the screen. Rain clicked against the narrow basement window like fingernails. "No," he said after a moment. "I don't believe it. Not entirely." Ed stood beside him in silence for a beat. The room smelled of wet concrete, hot dust from the inverter, stale coffee, and the sharp mineral tang that came off charging electronics, safe house perfume. "What do you need?" Ed asked. "Time, better captures, cross-reference on aliases, maybe infrastructure overlap. Maybe I'm chasing a linguistic anomaly because it's 2 in the morning and I'm 1 cup away from seeing omens in login banners." Ed held up the cracker packet. "Nutrition first, hallucinations later." Barnes accepted a cracker, regarded it briefly, and ate it with the resigned expression of a man consuming building material. "These taste like drywall." "That means they're shelf-stable." "That means they're criminal." Ed looked at the post again. "You calling anyone?" Barnes shook his head. "Not yet. There's nothing actionable that doesn't make me sound insane." "Hello, yes. I found some weird people on tour using science words weirdly. That'll go straight to the top of the pile." Ed grunted. "Fair." He moved to the back shelf and poured himself coffee from the insulated carafe. Barnes watched him do it, deeply offended on principle. "You're really drinking that voluntarily." "I was in Fallujah," Ed said. "Your standards don't apply." Barnes conceded with a small lift of his hand. There were certain arguments one did not win, only survive. He returned to the thread and opened the user history on Null Harvest. Sparse, deliberately sparse. That alone was interesting. Operators with something real to say often overcorrected into minimalism, thinking silence made them invisible. It didn't. It just concentrated the fingerprint. 2 prior posts on different onions, one in a restricted channel discussing timed release dependencies, another in a dead board connected to procurement chatter. Barnes took screenshots, archived them, then started mapping phrase similarity in his notes by hand. He could have automated more of it, but there was still no substitute for reading something until it itched. "Read this," he said. Ed looked over. Barnes pointed at Null Harvest's earlier post. "Stability during transit remains the governing variable. Field degradation is below expected threshold." Ed read it twice. "That's not malware." Barnes rubbed the bridge of his nose. "No, malware doesn't degrade in transit unless you zip it wrong. Could be code for something else." "Could be." Barnes' voice was flat. "And maybe the moon is actually a backup server." Ed drank his coffee. "You getting dramatic means you're worried." "I'm always worried." "No, usually you're annoyed. Different posture." Barnes gave him a look. "You've developed a distressing ability to read me." "I had to. You don't come with normal warning labels." A soft, involuntary laugh escaped Barnes before he could stop it. That was Ed's trick. Not warmth exactly, not comfort, but a pressure release valve disguised as deadpan. He turned back to the workstation and pulled logs from his previous captures. There was a cadence to good investigation. Observe, preserve, compare, doubt yourself, compare again. He ran through it carefully. The board's uptime pattern matched a cluster he'd seen before in invitation-based coordination spaces. Not proof. The service had changed mirrors twice in 48 hours, suggesting either active migration or nervous administration. Also not proof. But the users in this thread were responding on a schedule tighter than casual forum drift would allow. This was organized. He opened a small side pane and began building a timeline. Post-spike at 1912. 3 responses within 6 minutes. Dormancy. Reactivation at 22:03. Single authoritative correction by Null Harvest at 22:05. Silence. Then a new comment from Oxblood at 23:41. Local observations align. Local observations. Barnes typed it into the notes and underlined it twice. Ed. What did you hear on the shortwave earlier? Ed lowered the mug. Nothing useful. Regional emergency channels were routine. 2 transportation delays, a refinery outage out west, some shelter rotation chatter south side. Why? Barnes gestured at the screen. Because one of these idiots says local observations align, and if this is a systems operation, local to where matters. If it's not a systems operation, it matters a lot more. Ed came back over, slower this time. You think someone's running a field test? Barnes hated how plausible the words sounded in the room. I think, he said carefully, someone in that thread is talking about real-world effects as though they expected them. The rain intensified, rattling the window hard enough to make both men glance toward it. For a second, the basement felt deeper than it was, like they were sitting at the bottom of a ship, listening to the ocean decide what sort of mood it was in. Ed set the mug down. Then maybe you call it in sounding insane. Barnes said nothing. Ed folded his arms. Look, I know the routine. I know how this works. You don't send up smoke until you've got enough to survive questions. But every bad thing I've ever seen started with people waiting for cleaner confirmation. Barnes stared at the thread. The cursor blinked in his notes like a pulse. Give me 1 more hour, he said. I want to see if any of these aliases bleed into known infrastructure or social residue. 1 real hinge, 1 actual piece of connective tissue, and I can make a call without sounding like a late-night conspiracy podcast. You already sound like one. That's hurtful. It's accurate. Barnes cracked a tired smile. 1 hour. Ed nodded once. 1 hour. Then you either call it in or I start making speeches. That is an appalling threat. Ed left the room, and the safe house settled around Barnes again. The hum returned to the foreground. The monitors glowed. Rain moved over the city in slanted veils. Somewhere above, the building gave a small coughing pop as old pipes adjusted to cold. Barnes flexed his hands and went back to work. He pivoted from the thread to a broader set of correlated aliases. Using the notes he'd already built across the last week, he began testing for handle reuse conventions, separator choices, numeric suffix habits, lexical quirks. It was patient work, and mostly boring, which was exactly why it got people caught. Everyone imagined OPSEC failures as spectacular revelations, a selfie, a real name, a GPS coordinate left in a file. Usually it was pettier than that. The same user switching between an underscore and a hyphen, the same preference for remain over stays, the same habit of posting just after a regional shift change or before local dawn. People leaked themselves constantly. Identity was a bucket with holes in it. He found a minor hit. Vector Winter had once replied on another board within 90 seconds of an account named Winter Vector, logging into a now defunct discussion archive. Weak, maybe meaningless. Still, he tagged it. Another link surfaced through phrase similarity between acceptable range and within threshold tolerance on a procurement chatterboard whose focus had been bio-storage equipment 6 months back. Barnes stopped typing. He slowly opened that older archive. It had been one of those side alleys of the dark web that smelled of laboratories even through text, specialized parts, cold chain logistics, questions worded just carefully enough to imply misuse without technically confessing it. He had scraped it months ago as part of an unrelated inquiry involving stolen hospital devices and never revisited it because there were only so many hours in a week and criminals were an aggressively renewable resource. Now, he searched the archive for Null Harvest's phrasing. 2 hits, not direct, not exact, but close enough to make the hairs on his arms stand up. He copied both into the notes. User, NHarv. Transit stability is the governing factor. User, NHarv. Degradation under field variance is below projected loss. Field variance. Projected loss. Barnes sat very still. Then he opened a fresh pane, began manually aligning the language, and felt the mood in the room change, not in any supernatural sense, because Barnes had no patience for that nonsense, but in the precise and terrible way a pattern changed a room once you saw it. Like discovering the shape in the wallpaper was actually a stain, like hearing a laugh on an audio file and realizing it had been there the whole time. His pulse ticked up. This was no longer just odd. This was repeated, structured. The same conceptual vocabulary appearing months apart in communities that had no good reason to overlap unless something or someone moved between them. He stood, walked to the back of the room, and splashed cold water from a utility sink onto his face. The water smelled faintly metallic. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror above the sink. You could still be wrong, he told his reflection. His reflection appeared unconvinced. Back at the desk, he opened a secure note and started drafting a summary for escalation. Something concise, specific, and survivable. He kept it dry. Strange Tor thread, multiple aliases, language inconsistent with standard cyber operations, phrase overlap with prior procurement chatter tied to biological storage, possible real-world coordination or disinformation, recommend quiet review. He hated how thin it looked. Thin information got ignored. Worse, it got logged. He stared at the draft, then at the thread, then at the timestamp. 013. Null Harvest had posted again. Barnes straightened in the chair so fast it squealed against the floor. The new message was short. Null Harvest. Confirm your regional observers are in position. Noise profile must be separated from symptomatic indicators. We do not get a second clean window. Symptomatic indicators. Barnes felt a cold ribbon slide down his spine. He took a screenshot, then another, then captured the raw page source. His fingers moved with professional speed, but his thoughts were already sprinting ahead, ugly and unhelpful. Symptomatic. Regional observers. Clean window. The language had crossed a line. Whatever line he had been pretending still existed. He pushed back from the desk and called out, "Ed." Footsteps immediately. Ed appeared in the doorway like he'd been waiting just outside for the word. Barnes pointed at the screen. Ed read it, jaw tightening by degrees. "That's a call," Ed said. "Yeah." "You making it?" Barnes nodded once. "Yeah." He reached for the sat phone case on the shelf, flipped it open, and powered the device. It took too long to connect because technology enjoyed dramatic timing and had the soul of a bureaucrat. While it hunted signal, Barnes kept watching the thread. Another user replied. "Oxblood, North Sector ready. Pharaoh_12. Delay possible in municipal transport zones. Null harvest acceptable. Initial confusion remains our ally." Ed swore softly. The sat phone connected with a dry electronic chirp. Barnes keyed in the number from memory. A quiet contact, a back channel, someone who still took his calls because he had been right often enough to be irritating. 3 rings. A click. "This line had better be on fire," said a voice. Barnes didn't bother with a greeting. "I've got a Tor thread discussing a payload release window in language that suggests biological field deployment, not malware. Repeated phrase overlap with prior dark web procurement chatter involving biostorage logistics. They're referencing regional observers, symptomatic indicators, and anticipated public misclassification." Silence. Then, "That's a hell of an opener. I'm trying to keep the whimsy to a minimum. Source quality? Good enough that I'm calling you at midnight instead of writing notes for tomorrow. I'm preserving everything now." The voice on the line shifted, lost some of its skepticism. "Send what you have to the dead drop." "Already packaging." "Any geographic anchors?" "Not yet. Maybe regional, maybe multiple sectors. I'm still correlating." A pause. "You think it's imminent?" Barnes looked at the screen. Null Harvest had not posted again, but the thread was active. Users viewing, refreshing, waiting. "Yes," Barnes said. "I do." "Understood. Send the package. I'll push it quietly." "Quietly is all I'm asking." "That and a miracle, apparently." "Those are out of stock." The line disconnected. Barnes exhaled, not relieved exactly, but fractionally less alone with it. Ed had already moved into action mode while he was on the call. He was checking the room by habit: go bags, batteries, water, medkit inventory, sidearms, mags. Not panicking, never panicking, just listening to the shape of the problem and beginning to arrange the world around it. "You think we need to move?" Barnes asked. "Not yet," Ed said, "but I think we stop pretending tonight is ordinary." "That's fair." Barnes encrypted the evidence package, queued the transfer through the prearranged dead drop, and watched the progress bar inch forward with the self-satisfaction of all progress bars everywhere. While it moved, he reopened the thread and found a new post from a user he hadn't seen before. "Ashmarrow. Is Clinical Veil holding? Null Harvest. For now. Clinical Veil." Barnes stared at those 2 words until they blurred. Outside, a siren rose in the distance, not the lazy, half-hearted complaint from earlier, but a full emergency tone, urgent and ugly, slicing through the rain. Another joined it somewhere farther east, then another. Ed and Barnes looked at each other. "Coincidence," Barnes said automatically. Ed's expression suggested he would allow that possibility exactly once out of professional courtesy. Barnes turned up the scanner feed on a nearby receiver. Static, then fragments, unit numbers, cross streets, responders repeating themselves louder each time, as if volume could force coherence out of chaos. Subject non-compliant, unknown medical, biting, repeat, biting. Need additional. The feed dissolved into static. Neither man spoke. The basement suddenly felt too small for the amount of future pressing against it. Barnes looked back at the thread. He did not know what he expected. Celebration, maybe, or panic, or some monstrous little wink from whoever sat behind Null Harvest's careful prose. Instead, he got something worse. Calm. A new message appeared at 031. Null harvest. Deployment phase begins soon. Biological latency confirmed. For one suspended second, Barnes only watched the words exist. Rain on the window, sirens in the city, scanner static, the thin electrical whine of overworked power supplies, the stale taste of bitter coffee, the smell of wet concrete and cold metal. Every detail in the room sharpened to a cruel degree, as if reality had decided to increase the resolution right before bad news arrived. Ed read the post over his shoulder. "Well," he said at last, voice flat as a knife laid on a table, "that doesn't belong on a cyber forum." Barnes swallowed. The darkness beyond the screens seemed to lean closer. "No," he said. "No, it really doesn't." And somewhere above them, in the rain-soaked sprawl of the city, something began. Barnes did not move for several seconds after the post appeared. Not because he was shocked. Shock was a theatrical luxury, and the room had already spent its budget on sirens. But because the sentence had finally done what the rest of the thread had only threatened to do. It had violated the board's native language completely. He looked back through the earlier posts, then farther, into the board itself. Adjacent threads, older threads, dead arguments about municipal credentials, loader access, industrial persistence, patch gaps, relay timing, kill switch insurance, all the usual mechanical filth. Even the smarter operators on this board still thought in system verbs: access, hold, deploy, evade, burn. They argued about defenders, uptime, routes, maintenance cycles, and whether local admins were lazy enough to leave God mode keys in humanly stupid places. They did not say symptomatic indicators. They did not say clinical veil. They did not say biological latency confirmed. And they absolutely did not talk about correct classification, like a hospital was the target environment instead of a server room. That was the part he could now articulate cleanly. The thing that had been crawling under his skin since the title first caught his eye. This wasn't merely people borrowing jargon outside their lane. Criminal boards did that constantly. This was something worse. The thread was using two dialects at once, and it was native in both. Barnes pulled the thread and the surrounding board index into a fresh note pane and began typing fast, the way he always did when a pattern stopped being elegant and became personal. Why this doesn't belong here. Board ecosystem is infrastructure intrusion / municipal access / ICS adjacent tradecraft. Native success language should center persistence, access, disruption, defender response, observed language centers. Presentation, symptoms, classification, field degradation, public interpretation, vocabulary mismatch is not decorative. It implies operator familiarity with biological or clinical process. Thread participants are not speaking metaphorically often enough for the metaphor to hold. He stopped, reread the list, and felt his own pulse in his throat. There it was. Not eerie, not atmospheric, not bad vibes on tour. A procedural wound. Somebody had brought the wrong operational language into the wrong room and then used it too fluently to dismiss his cosplay. That meant one of two things. Either a biological operation was borrowing cyber infrastructure to coordinate, or cyber infrastructure had become the quiet back office for something much uglier than malware. Either way, the thread was no longer interesting because it was weird. It was interesting because it had broken the dialect of its own ecosystem and expected no one to notice. Ed had gone still beside him in the way he did when Barnes's silences got too exact. "What?" he said. Barnes kept his eyes on the screen. "It's not just that the words are wrong. That would have been enough for me. No." He pointed at the posts one by one. "Wrong words happen all the time. People imitate competence. They steal tone. They wear technical language like rental clothing." He tapped the newest line. "This isn't that. The grammar underneath it is wrong for the room. The priorities are wrong for the room. The assumptions are wrong for the room." Ed frowned. "Meaning?" Barnes finally looked at him. Meaning if this were really cyber prep chatter, they'd be talking about defender attribution, service impact, or access stability in system terms. Instead, they're talking about how something will look when it starts happening to people. He glanced back at the screen. That's not a style problem, that's a category problem. Ed read the posts again, slower this time. Then he said, "So it's not one weird thread?" "No." Barnes swallowed. "It's a thread that implies another environment underneath it, one this board shouldn't be able to speak fluently unless somebody brought it in." Outside, another siren rose, farther east this time, and held long enough to sound less like response and more like recognition arriving late. Barnes turned back to the workstation and opened a new file. Not escalation notes. Not yet. Something colder. Something that would let him strip the thread down to its load-bearing parts and see what other systems it touched. At the top, he typed one word, patterns. Then beneath it, he copied the title of the thread again. Window confirmation. He stared at it until the title lost its theatrical sheen and became what it had probably been all along. Not a warning, not a boast, but an internal checkpoint written by people who believed the rest of the city would misread their work for at least one cycle too long. That was the real injury. Not that the thread was sinister, that it had been designed to look forgettable in exactly the kind of room where forgettable things killed people first. And once Barnes understood that, he could no longer browse it like noise. He had to reconstruct it.